In the past 40 years, the incomes of the lower and middle classes have been under pressure, while increased profits are concentrated at the top of the pyramid, the 1%. What should the welfare state of the future look like to accommodate this trend? Guy Goris, former chief editor of Mo and now a freelance journalist, will moderate this discussion and dig deeper into the possible solutions for the future. Welcome to Stop the Redistribution from Poor to Rich. Guy Goris, I'd like to pass you the mic, so please give him a warm applause.
Thank you, Zoe. And thank you for skipping your midday meal for what will be the most important session. We are very happy to welcome three extremely well-selected guests to inform us about inequality, how to tackle inequality, how to build a counter-narrative, but especially how to build popular power to get us on a different way, away from growing inequality and towards better redistribution as it was meant. Because Zoe already mentioned that what we've seen the past decades is redistribution, clear, but from bottom to the top, from the poor masses to the 1% of the richest. And that trend has to be reversed. And we will be talking about that with three guests. If we can get them on the screen, that would be nice. The first guest that will speak with us is Nabil Ahmed. Welcome, Nabil, to Brussels, on screen at least. Nabil is joining us from Nairobi, where he works as head of the executive strategy and communications and as the lead author of the report Inequality Kills, the yearly report that Oxfam International is producing in the run-up to the Davos meeting of the rich and powerful in the world. Very happy that you can be with us. Second speaker, which will also join from Nairobi, is Chenai Mukumba. Chenai is Policy Research and Advocacy Manager for the Tax Justice Network in Africa. And then finally, we have May Buenaventura, who is joining us from the Philippines. May is Program Manager at the Debt and Green Economic Rebuilding Program of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. So, an international panel with a lot of expertise on the issues that we want to talk about. And we have only 1 hour, three great guests, and a lot of questions to answer. So, Nabil, let me start with you for the first question, or the first part of this session, to look into what we are really talking about, because Inequality Kills is the title of the report that you wrote. Inequality is the starting point of our session. But let me first ask you the most obvious and simple question, and you have 1.5 minutes to answer that. What is inequality? What are we talking about when we talk about inequality as you use it in the report?
Thanks so much, Guy, and hi everyone. It's such a pleasure to be at Forward Fest, so thanks so much for having me. I love this 1 minute 30 limit that you have, Guy. So look, inequality really goes to the root of the world's problems. It's this huge disparity that we see in which, for example, just 10 men, the world's 10 richest men, own more wealth than 3.1 billion people. And for us, it's about the gap between the rich and the poor, but it's really also about the gap between the very, very, very richest and really the rest of humanity, right? Because inequality impacts us all. And look, we know extreme inequality makes ending poverty impossible. It goes to the heart of the climate crisis. But second, it's so important to realize that inequality isn't just this other issue, but it's fundamentally about power. Because extreme wealth, it doesn't just buy you a nice yacht or a spaceship. It buys you politicians, impunity from justice. It buys you a pliant media. And the final thing to say, Xi, is this. we're saying, yes, inequality does lead to unhappy, unfair, unhealthy societies, and that's very important. But we're saying something more than that, that inequality itself kills. And we put a figure on it. You know, inequality contributes to killing someone every 4 seconds. And that's a conservative estimate, by the way. Thank you.
Nabil, the inequality that you're talking about is inequality in wealth. Is that income, or is it broader? It's wealth, because the real rich don't depend on income as we do. They get their increasing wealth from having wealth, right? So are there other forms of inequality that we should add upon this income in wealth or inequality in wealth to fully understand the extent of inequality, or is it mainly wealth?
Yeah, so it's about wealth, but it's also about income. It's about an economy in which the proceeds of growth go overwhelmingly to the top. So we're talking wealth, we're talking income, but it's so important here as well to say that these economic inequalities also intersect with gender inequalities, with racial inequalities, with health inequalities, and I can get to some of those as well.
So let's dive briefly into the report and get some of the crucial, essential data on the table here when we talk about this growing inequality. And the report mentions the 2,755 billionaires that saw their fortunes growing. I'm always impressed when a report comes up with a specific number like 2,755, not 56. So let me first ask, how do you get to those data? Where do you find them? If they're easy to find, then why are they not always in the newspapers?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So Oxfam for the last few years has been tracking extreme inequalities, been tracking also as part of that billionaire wealth. So we rely on data that's published by Forbes. Forbes provide an annual billionaires list and they track that. They also track it on a daily basis, by the way, so any of us can just log onto the Forbes billionaire list and look at that. Credit Suisse, the investment bank, also produces annual data on global wealth, right? Across the world, basically. And we are able to bring these different pieces of data together, and it's very complex data, to be able to come out with the statistics that we provide. And Gilles, let me tell you this as well, because Oxfam has, I think in some ways famously over the last few years, been tracking this gap between rich and poor. And every year we sit around the laptop and see, let's see what's happening with the data now. And literally just a few months ago when we were writing this report, we did the same thing, and we all then crowded around the monitor because we were shocked. We thought, this can't be real. Is this true? Because already we know the rises in billionaire wealth were crazy over the last few years, but something else happened during the pandemic, and it was really just off the charts. Because this pandemic, we're witnessing the biggest increase in billionaire wealth since records began. In fact, billionaire wealth has risen more during the pandemic than in the 14 years before combined. A billionaire was created every 26 hours. And at the same time, we're saying, look what's happened to the rest of humanity, and using World Bank data to show that COVID-19 has left 99% of humanity worse off. So the rich at the top getting extremely, extremely richer, and 99% of humanity worse off. And
is this split between the 1% or maybe it's the 1.0 or the 0.01%, because it's really the billionaires are the top of the pyramid, and you divide it against the 99%. I'm always a bit wary about this 99% because that's an awfully broad category encompassing everybody on Earth except for the richest. Is everybody worse off during the past 2-3 years, or is it more nuanced, more complex than that?
Yeah, so what the World Bank did is that they looked at people's incomes across the world, And where people were at the end of last year against where they were before the pandemic was less, and that's looking at the 99%. And Gilles, what this does speak to is this point that, you know, our understanding of inequality and how we've traditionally read about inequality and learned about inequality is talking about this gap between rich and poor. But now we're really looking at something that concerns 8 billion of us, 8 billion people of us, right? And that is, you know, just to talk about these 10 richest men right at the top, right? Just to talk about them just for a second. Their wealth alone has doubled during the pandemic, and it's risen at a rate, and you might want to hear me say this twice, at $15,000 per second. $15,000 per second. That's unimaginable increase in wealth, especially at a time when we're seeing declines in the rest of the world. And you're right, we can talk about the 99%, we can also talk about the bottom 50%, and we can talk about those really at the bottom who are suffering most during this pandemic.
So if you see this incredible increase of wealth at the very top, can you also explain it? Why did it happen during the COVID crisis in such an extreme way?
Yeah, sure. It's so important to understand the reasoning behind this. So let me say the first thing is that we are already have seen longer term trends accelerate, right? So especially over the last 40 years, over this era of the neoliberal economic experiment, you know, we've seen a surge in monopoly power. We've seen the privatization of public goods in many parts of the world, including here on the African continent where I'm based. You know, public goods like healthcare, like education, put into private hands. We've also seen the erosion of top income, wealth, corporate tax rates. So those at the very top paying less of what they earn and less from their wealth to tax. So you see the burden of taxation is really falling on, you know, the poor woman selling fruit by the side of the street. And you've also seen what we call liberalization in the labor market, you know, workers' rights attacked, and also, you know, workers' wages not keeping up with growth, basically. That was all longer term trends happening, Gilles, but let me just say that during the pandemic, many things happened, an acceleration of that, but a couple of really big things. Rightly so, governments pumped money into the global economy, into their national economies, to be able to stave off the worst impacts of the pandemic, including into financial markets. A lot of that money via the stock market went into the hands of the already very wealthy. And that's one big driver of inequality during this pandemic. The other one that I think is so important to recognize is that vaccine inequality has fueled all other inequalities, right? The fact that poorer countries and poorer people have been denied access to vaccines by rich countries, by pharmaceutical monopolies, has in turn increased inequalities. Be that, you know, just girls being left out of school, and children being left out of school, but we always know girls are disproportionately impacted when schools are closed, to just, you know, economies here are still climbing out of recession. And so we're seeing the profound impact of vaccine inequality, but also billionaires being the primary beneficiaries of the injection into the global economy.
The way you describe the inequalities is already an answer to an old and question that keeps popping up. But I still want to put it to you in an explicit way. Is inequality per se a problem? The old neoliberal narrative was that, no, it's not. If it's a rising tide, all boats lift, big and small. We know that it wasn't the rising tide, the neoliberal period. It was rather a storm, and small boats are not well fit for the storm that they had to face. But if you would have to say, what is really the problem with inequality, how would you define it?
Yeah, it's such, and I like the way you framed that question, because the data shows that a rising tide hasn't lifted all boats, that wealth and income hasn't trickled down. But there's also a moral question here as well. And let me just take the angle of poverty, for example, because you know, even the World Bank and others have shown how hundreds of millions of more people could have been lifted out of poverty had the proceeds of growth been shared more equally. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, and I think it's so vital, you know, in this era of climate catastrophe, to recognize that the lens of extreme inequality also applies to the climate crisis. The 1%, the global 1%, is responsible for double the emissions of the bottom 50% combined. So we know that the world's biggest polluting countries are driving this climate crisis, but also the world's richest people are driving this climate crisis. And the third thing is it's a problem of power. Extreme inequality. It's a problem of power when the richest people can disproportionately and have an uneven influence on the laws that are meant to affect all of us. And we look at the huge influence of the very richest and the largest corporations on issues like tax rates. But just look at this issue of vaccines, just as one example. It's in the interests of all of humanity to be able to have the world vaccinated, to be able to have vaccines for everybody. That's how we prevent new variants from emerging, for example, and that's beneficial for people in rich countries. But the powerful lobbies, the corporate interests, and really an ideology founded in neoliberal thinking has meant that hasn't happened. Instead, rich governments have protected these monopolies. And that has been a problem, not just for people in poorer countries, but for people everywhere.
And we know that it's not just a matter of health and distribution of vaccines, but also the long-term economic impact that has been created by the COVID crisis and all the shutting down of economies, which will impact the poor majority much harder and much longer, while the rich are getting rich of it. To close off, Nabil, what is your way forward? This is a forward fest, after all, so we want to look at the way forward. You have described how we're digging a hole of inequality faster and deeper than ever before, or at least than the decades before. So how do we get ourselves out of it?
Yeah, this is a question, and I think honestly, gatherings like this that bring us together are absolutely vital. Look, number one, let's realize that we have a problem. And raise our voices that we have a problem. It is by no means normal to have such extreme growth in billionaire wealth. And I think we have to really vocalize that is a problem. I think we also have to realize that we can tackle inequality, and the examples of countries that have taken measures to tackle inequality, be it Costa Rica implementing a universal healthcare system, to countries like Sierra Leone a poor country ensuring education for all, and you're seeing countries like the US now talking about taxing those at the very top. That's really important. So I think we have to realize it's fixable. But let me also say this, I think taxing the wealthy, taxing the super rich is a fundamental part of the solution. And I know we have Chenai coming up, and I'm looking forward to listening to her and the amazing work that they do. But it's about one-off solidarity taxes on the wealthy. It's about fundamental taxes on wealth. And that's about revenue. It's about availing revenues that we can then spend on transformative public goods, yes. But it's also about redistributing power from the 1% back to the 99%. And let me just close by saying this, Jean, thank you for this amazing opportunity, is that I think we have a problem of policy, yes, but I also think we have a fundamental problem of imagination. And if we look back at liberation movements in the wake of colonialism across the global south, if we look back at some of the leaders in the wake of World War II in Europe and the US, for example, we saw ambition. We saw President Roosevelt of the US try to set a top marginal income tax rate of 100% in the wake of World War II. They eventually settled on 94%, and it averaged 81% until the early 80s. So, we have a problem of imagination, and the way we fix that is by coming together, by organizing, by raising our voices, because it's ultimately movements that shift the dial of society and what I like to call shift the politics of the possible.
Okay, that helps us immediately to go forward. Thank you, Nabil, for your insights, and we'll come back to you at the end of our session. But we move across the city now to Chenai Mukumba, who will join us. And as I said, she's working for Tax Justice Africa, which connects perfectly to what Nabil was just saying as a way forward. Taxing the wealthy, taxing the rich is crucial, and not just in a feeble way, but straightforward. So, Chenai, let me ask you the first question that I have in mind for you, because yes, I think most of us will think of taxing the rich as the way forward or as a way forward. But when is it actually effective as a way to tackle inequality? What are the necessary conditions to make taxing a positive step towards a more equal society of opportunity for all?
Thanks so much for that question. And I think I echo Nabil's sentiments. Thank you so much for creating this platform where we can contribute to this conversation. So I love talking about tax. I mean, I work for Tax Justice Network Africa because what we and a lot of other institutions see is tax really as a core component to contributing to countries' developmental objectives. And so, with your question, how can tax be used as an essential tool for real redistribution? I think first and foremost, it needs to be recognized as such. Often when people are talking about tax, the only component of that conversation that comes to the fore is tax as a source for revenue generation, which it absolutely is. But tax, like you've indicated, is also a tool for real redistribution to address the issues that Nabil was just talking about now, specifically inequality. And the way in which you can use tax as a tool for redistribution is when you're ensuring, and we say this often in civil society, that everyone is paying their fair share of tax. So those who earn the most pay the most. But unfortunately, when you're taking a look at various societies across the world, and I work for Tax Justice Network Africa, so often, we tend to assess African economies and African societies. Unfortunately, you actually tend to see that the brunt of the tax burden falls on lower income households, lower income individuals, informal economies, small to medium enterprises. And when you tend to see that kind of shift within tax spaces, you're seeing tax essentially not being used as a tool for redistribution, and if anything, actually reinforcing our current situation, which is really reinforcing the inequality we're seeing. And so really it's to get our governments to actually see that tax, if used correctly, if identified as a tool for redistribution, can help us address this inequality that we're seeing in our economies. Because when you don't, really you're reinforcing, as I mentioned earlier, these inequities that we see in our societies, where those who earn the least end up contributing the most to our government treasuries.
Now, one of the questions that I have there is tax, even if it is a progressive tax, as it should be, putting the heaviest burden, in a sense, on the shoulders that can carry the most. It remains a national tool. It's an instrument of national social policy or of fiscal policy. But we live in a globalized world. A lot of the economy, and especially of financial economy and international wealth concentration, happens on a globalized scale on which national governments seem to have little bearing. So is tax in the 21st century globalized economy a viable tool for this redistribution?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think tax needs to be recognized as both a tool that can be used at national level, but understanding wholly that countries work within a system, within an international architecture. So decisions and discussions that are happening at a global level have direct influence at national level. So for example, and this is something that's being currently discussed at a global level, when we have a system that allows for, we were talking earlier about the rich, to take advantage of various loopholes and different mechanisms that enable them to channel funds out of countries at national level. This has direct implications on a government's ability to raise revenue at national level. So this conversation must absolutely be had not only at national level, but at global level as well. And I know we'll speak about this a bit later, but there's current discussions about how to address some of these loopholes that are taking place at the international level. And it's important for all actors to be a part of those conversations, particularly lower income countries, because they tend to be most disproportionately affected whenever we're seeing these loopholes at a global level that are essentially taking away their ability to raise the resources that they need at national level.
And the discussion that is taking place in OECD and driven to a certain extent by US new policy to have minimal tax floors across the world, is that a big step forward in that sense, or is it window dressing?
That's such a great question. It's something that we've been occupying ourselves with for some time now. Listen, I think, like I mentioned earlier, we do need to see reform of the international system. I think I mentioned earlier that gaps at that level affect the ability of countries to raise resources at national level. You mentioned earlier that it's being driven largely by the US. Absolutely. It's essentially taking place at the OECD inclusive framework. And this has been one of our first gripes, so to speak, with this conversation. Tax evasion, tax avoidance, and all of these other related illicit financial flows tend to disproportionately affect lower income countries. However, how many of those countries are members of the inclusive framework? So specifically, when you're taking a look at African countries, only half of African countries are part of those conversations. And less than half of those countries have actually identified the direction of these conversations as being helpful for African countries. So it's a conversation that needs to be had, but the way in which it's being had right now is one that I think begs question. You mentioned earlier that, part of that conversation is around establishing, a sort of a minimum tax. Essentially, what this is supposed to do is disincentivize companies from shifting their profits to lower tax jurisdictions. What's on the table now is a global minimum tax rate of 15%. In Africa, our average tax rate is really between 25 and 30%. So the extent to which a 15% minimum tax rate would disincentivize profit shifting is questionable. So, these are some of the issues that we think really need to be addressed because, as I mentioned earlier, unless reform is taking place at the international level, the extent to which national level conversations can be had would really not be as effective as we need it to be.
And one of the things that I would like to question also is taxing is a toxic word almost in many circles. People don't want to be seen as promoting tax because tax is taking away money that you earned. All of that narrative has been so successfully spread around the world that it's difficult to promote taxing. So in development narratives, we've seen the emergence of the domestic resource mobilization as a kind of a difficult term to hide taxing behind. When I was in Nairobi in 2015 for the Finance for Development conference, it was all about domestic resource mobilization because that's the way to find the money for local development in the local economy, in the national economy. Has there been any progress on that, or does it remain a kind of a narrative that pops up when it's needed internationally, but it's not implemented locally?
I think that's a great question. You're absolutely right. I know whenever I mention to people that I work for an institution that works on tax, I get, significant gawks because, like you rightly said, a lot of people don't enjoy, right? Neither is tax associated with any sort of positive sentiment. But I think what we have found is the need to really sort of reframe the conversation around tax. I mentioned I work for an institution called Tax Justice. And so when you are having conversations that speak to, essentially what we're trying to do is get the wealthy, like Nabil was making, to contribute more to economies so that everybody is able to benefit. It's a conversation that people are willing to have. When you indicate that, listen, you want to be involved in tax conversations because right now, when you take a look at the way your government is implementing tax, you're unfairly carrying the burden. A lot of people want to be involved in these tax conversations. Tax, like I mentioned earlier, is a lot more than just revenue raising, right? There's a conversation about redistribution. But another component when you're talking about tax is this discussion about the way in which tax can be used to sort of facilitate representation, right? Essentially, when people are paying tax, they then understand that to some degree they can hold their government to account to ensure that they are providing certain services. And so essentially, when you bring in that component of the conversation, right, link tax to the provision of public services, link tax to a conversation about promoting equity, promoting fairness, you then tend to see a lot of increased want to be involved in a conversation and a somewhat almost subduing of this negative connotation that tax comes with.
If it is so crucial for all these policy fields that you enumerate, then it begs the question, why is it so difficult to get it up, to make it happen? What is withholding countries in Africa, for instance, from being more aggressive in taxing their own rich and in taxing companies that produce a lot of profit from within their borders? What is in the way?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things. I mean, at national level, some of what we try to do as an institution is try to generate political will. Essentially, we need to get more policymakers wanting to take this conversation forward in order to see the kind of reforms that we need at national level that can promote domestic resource mobilization. Unfortunately, sometimes what we tend to see is, the very same people that we need to, implement certain reforms are those that are burdening from the current system, right? And so we advocate for legislation such as sort of beneficial ownership transparency, right? So we're able to see who owns how much and how, essentially, so that we can identify from whom we need to be taxing and see who potentially is avoiding tax. But I think what's a really, really important conversation, as I mentioned earlier, is also the way in which the international architecture tends to also cut at the knees these national level conversations. Unfortunately, although there's these sort of loopholes that exist at national levels, they are perpetuated because of the international architecture. Where the money is going to plays a big role in the way in which individuals at national level are trying to get money out, right? So addressing this international conversation is equally, if not more important, than addressing this national level conversation as well.
Would you say that a way forward for national governments on this is made impossible as long as tax havens are allowed to exist?
Absolutely, absolutely, because where is this money being taken to, right? If there was no sort of final destination for money that's being taken out of at national level, that would definitely reduce the amount of money being taken out of countries. But the extent to which secrecy jurisdictions, tax havens exist, that will always take away national government's abilities to address this issue of illicit financial flows.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Chenai. We'll hope to be back to the panel before you have to leave, because I understood that you have a time issue, but we'll hope to see you again at the end of the session. Let's cross over to the Philippines and bring in May Buenaventura, who is program manager at the Debt and Green Economic Rebuilding Program of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. So it's not just a vantage point of Manila, but of the Asian, Southeast Asian region, which of course we know is half of humanity. So thank you very much for joining us, May, from that perspective. And we were talking just with Chenai on what is withholding us from taking the necessary steps to do something about this inequality. And we know that it's not just people's movements or NGOs that are trying to bring out the necessity to fight against inequality. Even the OECD has been producing reports pointing out that it is bad for health, but also even bad for what they think is essential, namely economic growth. So if even the think tank of the rich countries agrees that inequality is a bad thing, would that mean that the people's movements like yours have friends in mighty quarters and that we can march together towards a more equal world?
Yeah. Okay. So good evening from the Philippines, and thank you for this opportunity. Yeah. So often we have now nowadays we have some similar readings of the situation, like the OECD or the IMF and the World Bank. They recognize the deepening inequality. They recognize that there's loss of revenues through profit shifting. But the problem is when you come to the solutions, they're offering many things that we've heard before. So, for example, in case of the countries in the South, for example, with the debt accumulation, they say that you're probably mismanaging your economy, or they blame it on corruption. Of course, these are issues that we have and problems, but they also fail to acknowledge and recognize their very powerful role in shaping the kind of economies and societies we have, in the way that Southern governments are also held captive through debt conditionalities, for example, that we are trapped into a neoliberal path of governance and managing our economies. So they recognize the issue, but they're also blocking what we think are really transformative changes that need to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To pick up on that, we've been focusing on taxing the rich before, but do you see other necessary steps to do something about this inequality, to reverse the trend of deepening and growing inequality outside or additional to taxing the wealthy?
Yeah. So taking off from that push for taxing the wealthy, I'm really, I'm really inspired by the way the movement and the pressure has grown to tax the wealthy. And I'd like to credit the work of civil society, of social movements, because we know from experience that these rights are not handed to us. We fight for them. So behind that push for taxing the wealthy, I think I really lay great store in the power of our collective work, in the power of movement. So we don't get these victories like, for example, recognition of the debt crisis. We don't get this kind of affirmations without global civil society really speaking out and pointing out these issues. So I think we need really to strengthen. I mean, we've been doing social movements work for a long time, but learning from the climate crisis, we really must stress the urgency of time. As Nabil mentioned earlier, the numbers are just astounding. The suffering, the multiplication of the suffering is just outstanding. So in the sense that we're asking for ambitious actions from these power blocks, we must also ask that from ourselves. No? Greater ambition on our part, which means greater efforts at organizing and educating people. Also greater efforts at strengthening our alliances and our networks, and building our analytical critique so that we can shape the discourse, present an alternative discourse to the dominant neoliberal discourse, and be able to capacitate ourselves to critically engage multilateral platforms where there is normative decision making. So those are some of the things that I think are important for social movements to do.
So building of a popular counter-narrative of civil society as a broad social movement is necessary to counter the power of those who are now deciding to enrich themselves, basically. Yeah. But that is a tall order, because we've seen across the world that even though people might be aware that there are inequalities built in structurally into the system, profiting the rich, profiting the powerful, it has been quite difficult to turn that around. And we have seen it also in Asia, in many countries. There might be strong civil movements, but to get to the power of the government seems to be a tall order. How do we do that today in a world that is saturated with social media, with a lot of entertainment, maybe rather, or misinformation, rather than capacitating information that you were referring to?
Yeah. So in social movements, we recognize that we're trying to transform society, and that is not an easy task. It does not happen overnight. So some of the changes we may find hard to see, or we're impatient that they don't happen quick enough. But we are also against very powerful forces, and when we make headway, they have this backlash. So there's that dynamism. But we always find inspiration in the gains we've had and continue to have. Like recently, you may know the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, adopted a new policy on energy that they're moving away from fossil fuels. So I don't think that would have happened without the really vigorous campaigning done, exposing the projects of the ADB and how they have their role in exacerbating the climate crisis. We've also had an increasing number of countries committing to shift away from coal. So I think those are really important victories that we need to remind ourselves that it took years, but that's how it is in changing societies. No? Also, the concept of illegitimate debt has reached the halls of the United Nations, no? Because previously that was not recognized, that there are such things as illegitimate and odious debts. So we really need to celebrate these victories more, because it's a source of learning, it's a source of hope and inspiration. And those things civil society movements and activists cannot be without, because this is really for the long haul, no? If we're looking at transforming societies.
Yeah. May you bring in, and it's obvious also from the organization you're working from, the issue of debt. We've been focusing more in the past half an hour on wealth and how wealth creates or accumulates into insufferable inequalities. But debt is an instrument of inequality as well, maybe more between countries, but also individuals, shareholders that profit from debt that is being paid off for decades now by the poor. So how far are we in getting rid of that, what you call illegitimate debt?
There have been very positive experiences in countries that they've reached the halls of their parliaments in having certain projects suspended based on the suspicion laid by audits on those projects that they did not benefit. So these are loans that violated human rights, destroyed the environment, destroyed local livelihoods, and we are asserting, like the fossil fuel projects, that these are illegitimate and should be cancelled. So that's both a discourse, a struggle of discourse, as well as really asking for concrete steps for the cancellation of those debts.
You referred to before some of the success stories or breakthroughs that you said we should celebrate more, which is quite important, I think, especially in a festival that looks forward like we do today. It still is a question, how do you maintain hope when there's failures? Just to make it concrete, next week the Philippines will be voting for a new president and vice president, and the prospects are not very good. The polls tell us that the new president will probably be the son of an old dictator, and the new vice president will be the daughter of a brutal current president. So that could be considered a failure. How do you maintain hope in the face of this history of struggle without always having successes?
Yeah. So I myself, personally, I feel very saddened by this possibility, because from my student days under the Marcos dictatorship, I've been an activist and worked hard for the ouster of the dictator, and now it's very sad that there's really a big chance that he will be the next president. So it's a time for reflection, no? Of on one hand, what have social movements been doing in this respect? Why is there such popular support for these kinds of leaders, the populist leaders? And and it's always a source not a reason for not moving forward, but a reason to reflect and learn from that. What can you do now that this is going to happen? So we're looking forward to exposing the debts from the Marcos regime that we will have to pay in 2025. So there's always that moving forward.
Use the opportunity as it presents itself. That's an important lesson that we should take. Not focus on the difficulty, but take the difficulty and turn it into an opportunity. I would like to bring in Nabil and Chenai back for a short debate or a short conversation with all three of you. And I would like to start from the question that we end with, actually. If we need to build popular power in order to fight inequality, how do we do it? What are the best suggestions that you three have in store to share with the audience and try to inform them about how we can work forward? And if I'm seeing right, Chenai had to probably leave already. So let me ask the question first to Nabil. What is a way to build popular power in 2022?
Yeah, thanks. What an amazing conversation so far. So a huge thanks to Chenai and to May as well. And I always think we can learn a huge amount, sorry to say this, May, from our Filipino friends, because we have many friends there, and the struggles you've gone through over the decades as well are a lesson for the world. So I'm a bit humbled to ask this question in front of May. But listen, so there are a number of things we can do, right? And I think just at a macro level, let me just say, just to start with, is that I think fundamentally we have to shift the frame of society. Because policies, what we call the Overton Window, which is the policies that seem to be acceptable as to a society, we have to shift that, right? And that Overton Window has been shifted through over time as well. And then the policies that will then follow that frame of society that we create. So there's a number of things that we have to do. I think, we have to basically be talking about these issues that we're raising here today, not just in and amidst our NGOs and in and amidst our activist circles, but with your grandparents and your cousins and your neighbors and your friends. And we have to really kind of mainstream these issues, not as activist issues, but are issues that are relevant. That's one part. I think the second thing I want to say is that I think, social media is such an important tool for us to be able to communicate, be able to get messages out there. We should spend a lot of time on it. I also want to say that nothing beats face-to-face, one-to-one conversations. Because I really believe that's where you can win people over. I think sometimes our social media prisms can reinforce where we're already at, and nothing beats human connection, nothing beats empathy. So I think that's the second thing I want to say. And the third thing I just want to mention is that I, for one, like to bring statistics, like to bring data to all of these issues. But honestly, from a perspective of how to win change, sharing stories, sharing and amplifying the voices of those people who are most impacted by inequality, nothing is more important than that. The stories of, and let me just end with this, Oxfam, as you know, we work in over 90 countries around the world. We fight inequality, we tackle poverty, we address the humanitarian crisis. We work in developing countries, global south countries, but we also work in rich nations as well. And just to give you one example, this always surprises people, right? Is that we work with poultry workers in the United States of America. We supported their workers' rights over years. And you have these immensely profitable companies, poultry companies, and one of the women we spoke to is a woman called Dolores, right? And she works in a chicken factory, and she and her co-workers had to wear diapers to work because their employer denies them toilet break. And she is a symbol of an economy that's working not in favor of poorer women like her, but was we have to share these stories. out there. So yeah, number one, let's shift the frame. Number two, yes, social media, but one-to-one conversations. And number three, let's share the stories and particularly amplify those voices.
Let me pick up one little thing, and you're free to comment on other things that Nabil has been saying. But the importance and the limits of social media seems to be interesting for me to hear from you what you think of it in shaping up a counter narrative and a counter force, because in the Philippines, the Filipinos are considered the most intense users of Twitter, of Snapchat, of WhatsApp, of almost any social media that's on the book there, which has been used by Duterte and now by Marcos and others. So are we savvy enough to battle them in the field where they're winning the game?
Sure, yeah. So I would absolutely say yes. But just like any other media, like print or broadcast, it can be used both ways, no? It can be used to transform, it can be used to oppress. So our tools cannot be limited only to social media. The youth who are made aware of the issues in social media, you have to have a way to reach them and organize them. Otherwise, it's all just, a cacophony of different messages. So, for example, we had a campaign before that really caught fire on social media on the 6% budget for education, but it had to be led into more organizing efforts for that to produce results. Otherwise, it would not have led to that. So it's also on how we use social media in connection with our other tools, but not social media alone.
Yeah. A final question that I would like to put to both of you is how effective, or how should we, that's a better question, how should we go about international solidarity in this fight against inequality? Because we've been looking at it from different vantage points, but we're here today in a movement that takes international solidarity as its core message and its core mission. And it's been complicated by a lot of reflection and debate about power inequalities. So what is the positive steps that movements like 1111 or Oxfam or APMDD or others can take in order to internationalize the fight? Because, as we've said, inequality is produced in a globalized setting, so we need each other probably to fight it. How do we do it? May?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I'm really, amazed at the power of solidarity between global North and South. And you mentioned the Marcos regime, and one of those expressions was the human rights campaign that really, gained much mileage in bringing down the dictatorship because of that support, North and South. So in the same way, the world is now increasingly connected, and I will cite the concrete example of foreign investments, in the North that are dumped here in the South, and for example also the public-private partnerships of corporations in Europe that are located here in the South. So we need to have synergies there and dynamism and collaboration in our campaigning and advocacy efforts. That there's work here where the companies are, the corporations are. At the same time, there's work in the global North where they are registered, because those things are connected. And also to be able to work distinctly on specific issues, but also to be able to work on multiple fronts. Looking at the connections. How is tax related to debt, or how is debt related to the climate crisis? Working on that distinctly, but also being able to work on it as broader frames, as multiple fronts and arenas that are connected. Yeah.
Nabil?
So great. So agree with May. And look, we have an economy that is ultimately structured in favor of the richest people, the richest countries, and the richest companies, right? And I think that has to be our starting point for understanding how things work, right? And like you said, we do live in an international and a globalized economy. I think national action and the power of national action is absolutely vital. And I think everybody has to feel the responsibility for getting their national action right. But I think we always have to connect it with international solidarity. Because for me, it's, my family's originally from Pakistan. I'm born and raised in the UK. I now live in Kenya. And doing the work that I do has always made me realize that, the struggles facing a poor black man, for example, a black man living in poverty in the UK, you can find the linkages between what he faces and what a poor woman textile worker is in Pakistan, and they are both undermined and impacted by global rules that exist not in their favor. The one thing I would also say is I think part of global solidarity is humility, and part of global solidarity is also about amplifying those voices that need to be heard. So especially now, I know of amazing organizations as part of this forum doing amazing work in Belgium and across Europe. One of the best and most important things I think we can do is try to raise the voices of people from across the global south in particular, as well as the poorer people within our community within Western Europe, for example, in the forums that those voices need to be heard. And I think we have to consider, our NGOs and our platforms that we have really as a means to amplifying the voices of right and and mechanisms of solidarity. And I think that's an absolute. And we've done this just now, for example, through the amazing People's Vaccine Alliance that many organizations are part of to really address cruel vaccine inequality that means that rich corporations and happy pharmaceutical monopolies could literally deny billions of people vaccines, right? We've seen this coming together of organizations around the world, and part of that in amplifying those voices.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to wrap up because we spent our hour looking at global inequalities that are growing completely out of control, that are impacting the world in the first place, the poor majorities, but also, as has been mentioned more than once, the climate crisis, for instance. We have discussed the fact that we need to tackle this inequality, maybe first and foremost by putting in place just taxes where we start with the rich and the wealthy and then build down rather than what we have today. And in order to get there, you have all stressed the importance of building popular movements, of building counterpowers, of being in international solidarity. And that international solidarity should be built on national action, on national responsibilities, on taking action where you live and then connect it with each other, because many of these issues are connected and can only be solved in a global or international context. Nabil, Ahmed and May Buenaventura, and then Chenai also, who had to leave just before. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you in real life somewhere soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much too.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.